hombre rico, huh? Oro. They were looking for gold and to become dominant. Ninguna persona mande me. Nobody commands me. Nobody orders me around. And everybody was out there to do that. And so they established a thing called, I'm not even sure in this book if you have it mentioned, but encomienda, which was a land grant by the, and all the people that on that, they could work it for you, and you could sit back, and that's where the hacienda systems came out. Latifundia, big, huge farmland, which is still prevalent in much of Latin America. So what I'm saying is that very early on, they made use of the Indians for labor and that sort of stuff until too many started dying off. And of course, that's where blacks came in. They had some resistance to disease, that whole schmear, if I'm stopping in the
no, you're fine, you're fine.
But then, as you already alluded to, the French and particularly the English, different philosophical base. They just wanted land and get rid of the Indians. They just want to expand, and we have a series of sad historical trail of tears. And those Indians being moved and constantly moved, expansion of the West from the East. And the kind of situations there you really ought to pay as being an informed, educated college student or an educated member of our community, really read some of those treatises on the Trail of Tears with Cherokee and who had their own language written, had adopted the alphabetical systems and had their own writing and books. Didn't care, truly among many people, not with some major exceptions. The only good Indian was a dead Indian. That was a sort of part of the philosophy, get rid of them. And there were very specific things which you might get to in just a moment to illustrate that.
I was going to say, you mentioned the Trail of Tears. I have a friend of my mom's actually lives along where that happened at. And if you look at the name of the two towns, there's either Oak Grove, Kentucky, or there's Fort Campbell. You can find, if you look into the history of those towns, you can find a lot of good information out about those. They have a lot of them.
Yeah,
and they're still finding remains from Native Americans.
Like Mario said, in all of these subjects, there are thousands upon thousands of dissertations and not many less books turned out on almost all of these topics over the last 150 years and 100 years. Sorry.
That's okay. So the discussion of the numbers, like we said, even on the low end, a lot, and what this chapter touches on is how these numbers vary so greatly based on the source, based on where they're coming from. But basically, they also pointed out that there was kind of this ideology that this was some type of Eden before people arrived in the New World, and it really wasn't. There were diseases, and there was infighting, there were wars amongst the natives, and so
Aztecs were not. They were pretty bloody.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And so based on the methods that they used to determine the population, it said Mexico could have had a decline from smallpox from 67 to 98%, and the Andes could have been 70 to 98%. But even at 67 or 70%, it's a massive portion of population. And so, they questioned, was the introduction intentional? And to me, I don't think it was intentional.
Yeah.
I don't think it was intentional, except in the instances in which it's recorded that it was intentional, like when the Ottawas were given the blankets that were infected, and biological warfare is basically what that was. But I think it was unintentional. But then there were these opportunistic people who saw that as weakening the people that they were battling against, and inevitably they were able to conquer them. Like I said, the colonists celebrated the decline of the native populations by and large because they just wanted them out, wanted them off the land, and they viewed them as less than humans. But Spanish and French traded with them. There were different viewpoints.
There's one more thing that just go to her last words. It's like the Spanish and many of the French, most of them maybe, that came over here, set up their trading and their lifestyle, intermarried. English almost all brought their wives or separate shipments. So there's a lot more indigenously mixed, what we call There are many different groups if you
Oh,
want to
yeah.
type them genetically, but mestizos, indigenous, and then Castilla in Mexico alone.
Yeah.
Much less all the black
Yeah.
African slaves, some of which had run away from different places, interbreeding. So that didn't happen in terms of the colonial
Yeah.
mindset of the English.
Right.
So that had obviously a lot of different fallout and ramifications.
Yeah.
And then they impacted the disease, obviously, they never had a renaissance like the Europeans, it devastated them. The fact was that there were so many people that died. They lost their tribal elders who were the keepers of their culture, and they lost their faith. They were totally demoralized to the point that I think that if smallpox didn't wipe the bulk of them out, it helped to
Pave the way.
accelerate that and pave the way because it was just, I tend to, I guess from being a nurse, I put myself in that position and I think, how horrible, years and years and years of this devastation and no end in sight. And there was never an end in sight. And at some point, people just give up. They get to the point where they're just defeated. And that really stood out to me.
Let me interject a phrase or word you used. They didn't have their own renaissance. Well, I'd actually disagree that because I was in South America this past summer.
And,
I
I'm
went
focusing more on North America, so I
but even the Aztecs and the Toltecs, you have to remember that they already had, their own numeric system. They had their own accounting system. Like the Aztecs, there's a book that I read years ago. It was Why the Aztecs Fell So Easily. Actually, they were dictatorial, and one of the things that the Spanish, when they landed in Veracruz in the Gulf of Mexico, remember they couldn't talk to the indigenous people, but they hung around for a couple of months, and they started to detect something about these other people that were controlling them. Of course, they didn't know the names or whatever. And then they saw the tax collectors. Okay, so then the Aztecs were really exacting about saying, hey, listen, guys, a certain amount of goods are due, whether it's corn, this or whatever. So they had their own system. It worked for them. It was dictatorial. I'm not saying it was good, but it worked for them. And then the Incas had their calendars and the Mayas had their calendars. Okay.
I have a little, if I can get about 15 minutes,
Okay,
I have a
so-
bunch of stuff.
Well, that's
So within their own context, they were really well developed. Now, was it like the Renaissance in Europe? No, it wasn't. But
Yeah.
they had their great valuable things.
It seemed to me it was more like the Renaissance, how it was a silver lining, not necessarily.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
I meant in that there wasn't a silver.
Oh, yeah, for them, yeah.
Well,
There
the
was
truth is,
silver lining
the
for the
truth is that
colonists.
the populations, indigenous populations, have never fully recovered.
Right.
With
And,
small
well,
minor
and
exceptions.
I think you still see the ripple effect, if you go to some reservations,
Yeah,
that
in the
they're
United
so
States.
Alcohol was in
impoverished,
there,
and
and
there's
sure.
so much alcoholism. And this little, on page 56, this entry from this Mayan chronicle, it just was so sad for me, because they talk about the stench of death and how they lost their grandfathers and fathers, and then, it says, your grandfathers died, and with them died the son of the king and his brothers and kinsmen, so it was that we became orphans, O my son. So we became when we were young, all of us were thus, we were born to die. So it was a legacy that people were born into, if you had a child in the middle of this, they were born to die, they were born into this legacy that was so devastating. And then, I guess the other thing that stood out to me was the Jesuits, how they became caretakers of a lot of the sick natives, and while that was generous of them to some degree, they used that to convert them. They basically they had immunity. They'd been exposed. They had immunity, and they kind of used that to bring them over to Christianity. And I don't know what they told them, but I can imagine the conversations. If you convert, our God will heal you. Well, because they had somebody caring for them versus the people they all were sick and nobody was caring for them, so they died of dehydration or starvation. I imagine that their survival rates were much higher when you have somebody taking care of you and feeding you, and so in the natives' minds, they're believing that this God is healing them,
Yeah.
and I think that they had conversions because of that.
Just real quick, little footnote. Do you remember the movie The Mission? It was about 20 years ago with Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons. If you ever get a chance to see that movie,
I
that's
think I
really
saw
good.
it,
It kind of
Oh.
touches a little bit on this subject. So
South
that's
America,
it.
the seniors were seniors.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, anyway, basically, it's pretty sad to read.
Yeah,
this,
it's a depressing chapter.
Because, with the war, the slavery, with the religious oppression, with the smallpox, with everything, they were doomed. There was just no
Diseases,
positive.
that's the base of an awful lot of history, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I think we better let Ian, if you not have a section here.
Yeah, I had 65,
A few points, okay. Did I get everybody's, little cover,
You got mine.
and did I get yours
Okay.
from last time I did it? Excuse me. Yeah.
Yeah, I got mine from home. My thing that I had to read up on was French Jesuits. They kind of had a thing where when they were there, the natives would say that it was their fault, but because of
That it was the Jesuits' fault?
that it was the Jesuits' fault. But the natives would say that it was. However, the Jesuits would kind of think along the lines, no, it's not us. This is because of their own sin. Again, this whole thing seems to be going back and forth in between religion.
Mhm.
Well, as I went through and I was reading it, this Jesuit came to realize after a while, at first he was oblivious to it. He was kind of saying, yeah, it's not God doing this, it's their own sin, it's their own evil, and so on and so forth. Well, he finally came to realize after a while, and this is in one of his journal entries, the way he put it was, wherever we go, we bring nothing but disease and death.
Mhm. He made that connection.
He made that connection, and nobody else did. But he never really brought it to anyone else.
That might be heresy if he was vocal about it.
Yeah, yeah.
But he had written that down in one of his own journals. That was one of the only things that caught my eye was he started to make that correlation.
Yeah. Yeah, and both these points are well taken, because within the hierarchy of the church, there were various folks in Central America where I know more about, but Sahagún, for example, in his writing and stuff, he tremendous reprimands, and to this day, there's a bishop I knew, Samuel Ruiz, that used to supported some of the Zapatistas' goals in Chiapas, because I was there during that little revolution that they had. And he was threatened by the large, if you want to say elite Spanish landowners for sticking up for these landless peasants. And I published some stuff in which I relate the way the peasants are held in San Cristóbal de las Casas, a little town but named after a bishop that was speaking for them, and this Bishop Ruiz followed his path. But they were ostracized by the Roman Church, the head of the Roman Church for doing that, exactly what you were saying here. And they saw those connections and how poverty kept interrelated to it. And I can remember talking with a couple of native informants, and they would talk about, and I'd see it right before me, these little sidewalks. There was a landowner or clearly a Spanish guy coming up the street. They were expected to go off into the gutter, walk off to the side, and let him. This is in 1990s. So both points made well, but I just thought of something about the Catholic Church itself imposed. Yeah, I didn't go too far. There were different kinds of recallings. Go ahead, Ian. I'm trying to interrupt.
That was probably one of the only things I really noticed on it. It's just the way he started making the correlations, but he never voiced his opinion on it.
Yeah.
He probably would have died if he wasn't.
Even the natives would just start avoiding him for the most part.
So what do you think? I mean, that's really sort of an old version of whistleblowing. There's something almost, you discover these
Yeah.
kinds of connections, but then what do you do with them is the other thing, isn't it? Good.
You're about to die for saying anything about it.
Good. I'm sure to get a muffin for everyone. I don't want to drag those home. if you want that.
We'll take one on the way out.
It's so frustrating to me, and I know it's like beating your head against the wall, but this egocentrism, this superiority complex that people have, and yet it repeats over and over.
Yeah, but you know, that's part of our history though. There's a,
It's part, the
I
problem
wish
is,
we could leave it a part of
the
it.
problem is it's part of humanity.
Humanity,
That's what I
right.
feel bad about.
Yeah.
You know, every group
yeah,
has its name, I think I mentioned this before, you know, talk about hunters and gatherers.
yeah,
Eskimos are the eaters of raw fish, and that was intended as an insult, raw meat eaters.
yeah,
As an insult term from the Athabascans next door, where they, you know, sometimes would be trading, in fact, sometimes exchanging bloodline.
yeah. Well, you know, to underscore just real briefly what you just talked about mankind, I mean, look at this, what happened in Rwanda with those two tribes,
Tutsis
the
and,
Tutsis and
Hutu and Tutsis.
and I remember the internet wasn't as advanced as it was as today, but I did remember looking at some photos of these natives.
Yeah.
I'm not from Africa, so
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but I'm not being insensitive, but I couldn't tell the difference, but apparently they could, and they were mutilating each other only because one lived on this side of the river and the other one lived on the other side. But as far as I'm concerned, look, first of all, you guys are human beings, you come from the same region, you're probably related, but you're killing each other in the most primitive way.
You know what, look at gang warfare.
I was just gonna say that.
Same thing, gang warfare, it's like, it's this insane domination that people feel like they have to have. And
So anthropologists talk about those as phenotypes, observable outside differences that anyone can maybe make some, but you gotta be careful where you look at. Anthropologists did a great study on race, and it's something we spent a week on looking at that. That's
It's been a more than a
there's
week.
no biological definition that holds up for race. It's purely a social, cultural definition that people get used and mixed up. And in fact, in some areas of South America, members of their own family are sometimes classified as different race because of behavior and a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah.
So there's all of that behind it. But in the case of Tutsis, very quickly, they were put in power when the British left, and that was one of the things that was always sought back for. But as far as what you said, just they're neighbors.
Yeah.
They're sharing children and
Yeah.
babysitting, and next to getting hacked
Yeah.
to death. Let's go, just in the remaining time, because this will finish up what we're going to probably do with smallpox. And it's a quick review of what's been partly talked about today, with a couple new things. This is one of the largest viruses, and I spend more time again when I haven't watered it down like this class, but we talk about some specifics of the 35, some of those genes that makes virulence possible in their shift. Two forms already, which we're told, nicely outlined by Mario earlier. Before Jenner, and I thought this was just kind of interest maybe, I think there was something about it in there, but people observed long times ago, as Mario pointed out, that cow milking maids developed a modest form of cowpox, and it protected them against any, full-scale human pox, smallpox. And in China, they inhale the powder from the dried scabs. This moves into pustules, at the end, awful stuff. And from there on, you're particularly contagious until those all dry off. And then, but some of the material was rubbed into cuts and scratches in Near East and Africa. This is before Jenner even came on the scene. There appears to be no animal reservoir today. It's non-zoonotic, spread through trade and colonial expansion, except that I mentioned the other day on your zoonotic list, there is a close molecular trademark with monkeypox. So I do not know enough about how much that would take to expand. Oh, I got sticky, I took off here. It enters through, as Mario told us, droplet infection and inhalation, mucous membranes, and goes inside of those. I don't know, moves to the lymph nodes where it reproduces and then goes out again into the bloodstream where it multiplies again, and then into the 9 days. Here's the confusing thing, and some of the people that had it, of course, it's like general influenza, headache, fever, chills, often nausea, similar to flu. Then a rash appears, and you get these pockets, as I think I have somewhere here, President Lincoln. A lot of people don't know that, but his pock mark, he came home from giving his Gettysburg Address, and he wasn't feeling right, and a headache, and started coughing, and just fever and stuff. He came out, luckily, a light dose. So, you know, different immune systems handle some of these things. It makes survivorship in the old days. But it was basically a non-discriminatory disease again. It's also, this is something we haven't talked about yet, very much. It can be transmitted by inanimate objects. We mentioned clothes and blankets given out, bedding, and it lasts for quite a long time where it's viable. And this is something that Sierra mentioned briefly, but this is actually Colonel Henry Bouquet wrote, "I will try and inoculate the Indians with some blanket," that is to say, give it to them, "that may fall into their hands, and take care not to get the disease myself." Blankets apparently were contaminated with scabbing material and were purposely passed on to Indians. So I've heard this story about Kit Carson. I do not know, but this has, and if you're interested at all, spread of disease among highly susceptible. This is page 25. This is the textbook and where it appears on it. And now it appears to have gone onto the earth, disappeared, as we mentioned. Killed 300 million. Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
Kings, queens, generals, paupers, farmers. This is Illinois man, 1912. I downloaded this from a public health site, I forget where, some years back.
Actually, I saw that on one of my links when I was doing a little research on
This is one of the last cases we have in Bangladesh. It's awful. As that description Sierra read, you can't turn, you can't do anything. Often this is in the mucous membranes inside, epithelial cells, lining all your organs, as epithelial cells do. So, very vicious and a sad, sad disease. Now, this is an interesting quote, written in 1947 from an MD. "Smallpox was the captain of the men of death in the New World Biological War. Typhus fever, the first lieutenant, and measles, the second lieutenant. They were the forerunners of civilization, the companions of Christianity, the friends of the invader." It's quoted in Epidemics in History, Disease Tolerant Materials. And that book is, actually I didn't put on it, that book is in 2005 or 7, I forget. "It is clear these diseases, particularly smallpox, advancing in the front of actual arrival of Spanish and Cortez in Tenochtitlan, which was the capital of the Aztecs, or the Mexica as they were better known. I have taught this course and taken students down there for 20 years, and if not more. And it's pretty amazing because Mexico City is built on the top of Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was a city built on an island in a series of 5 lakes around it. And they had, as the next diorama shows you, causeways, as Ms. Mario alluded to, very advanced in daily markets. They had a form of capital. Cacao beans, chocolate beans, was their money. And money truly grew on trees. Cacao grows on trees, and so you get chocolate. It's the strangest thing. It grows right out of the bark. It doesn't go off a branch. It's just right out of the different parts of a branch, and just break it off, and then you process it in a certain way to get chocolate. But that was their money. And it was so sophisticated that they used to have money police. In the market police watch for people and go periodically sample cacao beans in an exchange action of money, because people would hollow them out and they would be filled with dust or dirt or something. The cacao beans.
Counterfeit money.
Yeah, counterfeiting cacao beans.
Hilarious.
But that shows you the sophistication. They had police and everything else that were operating beyond theologies that were very complex. But Mexico City, when after Cortez conquered this in 1521, largely due to advance of disease, and largely smallpox, though not exclusively. they filled in all that lake bed area, and that's no wonder that if you go to Mexico City, you see some of these buildings that are sinking. Down underneath this isn't where it was supposed to be built.